Hello, and welcome to Missing the Exit. I'm your host, Jared Stranberg. Life may not be like the film Final Destination, but there are times when people miraculously survive fatal situations. Each survival story has a lesson, applicable in practice or in our perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, seeing as how this is the first episode of Missing the Exit, I'd figure I'd do an introductory podcast by using me as the first subject. Let's start off with the earliest instance of me dodging death is a secondhand experience, because I wasn't necessarily old enough to remember, but my mother was. So, kind of a backstory how this story came about. When I was a younger lad, I was exceptionally hostile and angry about a lot of things. Mostly, I just get sucked into my ultra competitiveness when I'm playing video games, and I would get very hostile at the computer or at the PS3, whatever I was playing at the time. And I remember one time I was just getting absolutely destroyed online, and I was about 12. And I came out, and since I couldn't scream obscenities in front of my mother, who was sitting on the recliner while I was playing video games in the office, I kicked the crap out of the couch. With all the 12-year-old might I can muster, it wasn't really that impressive. I really didn't do that much damage, but it was more to the fact that I was just so irate. I was so livid at my current predicament in video games that I decided to just let out all this rage. And I remember my mother admonishing me and telling me, "You should be careful with your anger, Jared." I said, "Why? It's just a video game. I'm just mad that I'm losing a video game. What's the couch going to do?" And, well, she said that anger can have unknown side effects. Because she said that she almost killed me at one point. I was shocked. I thought my mom was saying that at one point she was about to straight up strangle me when I was a kid, and I didn't even know. No, what happened was early on in my life, my parents were not necessarily in a financially stable place, which consequently leads to arguments. I'm certain you know all about marriage couples and their ability to argue over finances. It's arguably one of the most popular topics to disagree on amongst married couples. And my mother, who also had quite the temper, stormed out of the house in a very irate fashion, and she slammed the door. You see, the problem with slamming the door in the house at the time was my brother and I would watch cartoons on this couch every Saturday morning. And it was a Saturday morning. We should have been sitting on the couch, and above that couch was a very heavy oak shelf with lots of china, lots of glass, various family memorabilia, a lot of heavy things that could be easily lethal if they were to break. When Mom slammed that door, that oak shelf came tumbling down. All the glassware, all the china, all the heavy objects that were up there, above what should have been my brother's head and my 2-year-old toddler head. However, by some miracle, my brother and I decided to not sit on that couch that day. We decided to sit somewhere else. And instead of having several pounds of china and glassware fall on a toddler's head, along with a heavy oak shelf, we just watched it fall down, apparently. And my mother told me that there was a lesson to be learned in that instance, and one that it took her years to learn, and why she has hardly ever been angry ever since. And that is, anger can kill. If not directly, then indirectly. So you need to check yourself. You need to watch what you're doing, watch what you're saying, because you don't know the consequences of your actions until after they happen. So tread carefully with your anger. The second instance of me nearly dying, I was a couple months away from my 7th birthday. It was May of 2004. And my family went on a vacation to the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone National Park, places like that. And we spent a whole week out there. It was probably the longest vacation I ever had, and it was the only vacation that didn't involve me visiting family. And I, as a very stereotypical boy, I would climb things all the time. I wasn't necessarily afraid of anything, despite the fact that I probably should be. You know, I was just a very dangerous person when it came to what I should not be doing. So I remember we were about 3 hours away from where we were staying. We were staying in this log cabin out in Wyoming, and we had driven out in the general direction of Utah, and my parents wanted to stop and take a look at the map because back in 2004, we didn't have GPS. We only had a big old atlas that was probably bigger than my torso as a 6-year-old child. And when they pulled over, we pulled over next to this cliffside. Well, I don't want to say a cliffside. It was more like a steep incline of rocks. And I begged my parents, please, can I go climbing? I want to go climbing. I want to go climb that. My parents, tired and wanting to reorient themselves, said, all right, yeah, you can go take 10, 15 minutes, go climb while we go figure out what we're doing. So me and my brother decided to scale this 45, maybe 50 degree incline of just rocks and boulders and what have you. And keep in mind that this was late May and it was pretty warm outside. It was probably 85, 90 degrees outside. And so as we were climbing, I remember getting about 45 or 50 feet up. And I wanted to stop, sit, rest, relax, just look at the view. Honestly, even as a 6-year-old, you could appreciate the stunning beauty of just all the green and the mountains in the distance piercing the sky. It was truly an impeccable view. But when I stopped, there was a snake that happened to be sitting right next to me, within arm's reach of me. And I'm not talking about my adult arm's reach. I'm talking about my 6-year-old self could reach out and touch this snake. I was like, oh, it's a snake. This is so cool. I want to touch the snake. I want to pet the snake. It's a pet snake. I want a pet snake, right? Wouldn't that just be awesome? You see, the snake was not too happy. It was hot outside, so he was pretty energetic, and he was shaking his tail pretty violently at me, with the rattle on the end of it, and I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what kind of snake it was. I just knew it was a snake. My brother, however, knew exactly what kind of snake it was. And, he was telling me, he was saying, Jared, get away from that snake. Get away from the snake. And I didn't listen to him. What does my brother know? My brother doesn't know anything about snakes. He doesn't know anything about what can kill you and what can't. So, my brother, being the snitch, or rather the smart person, decides to go tell my mother. My mother yells at me saying, Jared, get down here now. At that moment, it's like, my mom's just being worried. She's just listening to what Joel is saying. She's just being scared and afraid, and a typical mother, right? I didn't want to listen to my mother. I wanted to pet the snake that was shaking its rattle at me and was probably pretty ticked off considering the fact that I was encroaching upon its territory. And then my mother must have told my father, because what came next, I swear by my 6-year-old self that my father could have shook the mountains with his voice. My father was generally, he could be angry, but the times he was angry were few and far between. And when he was angry, you obeyed. Otherwise, the wrath of 1,000 suns would come down upon you.
Jared Frederick Stranberg, get down here now!
I was shook. I was totally concerned about how sore my behind would be for the next 4 or 5 hours. And I disappointingly decided, all right, I'm just going to have to climb down. I'll have to pet the snake at a later day. Oh, well, I could always find another snake, right? My father and mother spent the next 3 hours reaming me out for wanting to pet the snake and being disobedient, and basically saying that could have killed me because we were several hours away from any form of civilization or hospital or whatever. And if you guys know anything about rattlesnakes, you know that a bite could be lethal for an adult in 15 minutes to half an hour. So as a 6 to 7-year-old kid, you can imagine that I wouldn't have had much time. So the first lesson from this story is not everything is friendly. Not everything wants to be your friend. No matter how cool you find it, not everything is good for you. That was the first lesson that I learned, and that was probably the first time that I realized at that age that there are animals and living things and cool things that I found fascinating that could easily kill me. The second lesson came several years later. I don't know at one point, but I remember bringing the story up to my father. At that age, I always kind of just took my father for kind of cold and stoic and uncaring. I knew, as a father, he loved me, but, he never really expressed it for the longest time. But when I asked him about the rattlesnake incident, he said, "Can we please not talk about that?" And I looked at him quizzically as I asked him why. It's years past, I'm fine. And he told me that for 3, maybe 4 weeks after that incident, he had nightmares of me, his youngest son, dying in his arms, and that he couldn't sleep. And that was one of the few moments in time where my father, instead of being this opaque brick wall, he was made of glass, and I could see right through him. I could read his every emotion for just that moment as I realized precisely how dearly he cared for me and how desperately it would have destroyed him and my mother to lose me into a rattlesnake at the age of 6. So, the second lesson here is, do not mistake stoicism for apathy. It may seem like people don't care because they don't say it, but they do. I can promise you that. The third instance of my brush with death, I was a freshman in high school. It was January, and it was stereotypical freshman high school things, having to deal with coming back from winter break, and I was just like, oh, I don't want to be here, blah, blah, blah. And I remember sitting in my world history class, and for some reason, at one point, everything seemed kind of blurry. I thought I just needed new glasses. I had glasses since 7th grade. It's like, oh, maybe my sight is changing. Maybe I just need to get better glasses. I'm going blind at the age of 14. And so I told my father that I had vision changes, and he scheduled an appointment for me. And it was like 2 or 3 days away. but I noticed later on that night I was drinking water constantly. I was drinking everything in sight. Milk, water. I think we had some soda in the fridge that I was kind of chugging a little bit. Anything that could satiate my thirst, because I was drinking and then I was having to go to the bathroom because I was drinking so much. But no matter what I did, I was just constantly thirsty. It was ridiculous. And I told my father that just a day or two before the doctor's appointment, because we had to get approval from the doctor before we went to go to the eye doctor. Then my father had this shadow of concern just wash over his face as I told him that. Because he already knew that I was having sight problems, but now I'm thirsty all the time. Now he's starting to think. Because my father is a type 2 diabetic. He knows these things. He knows these symptoms. He knows what's coming. He's not certain, but he has suspicions and he has fears. And he told me that's concerning. The symptom of being thirsty plus my eyesight changing is, it's starting to make a checklist here. So I went to the doctor, and it was late in the afternoon because I had to wait till I was out of school in order to go. And they ran some tests, but they said that they wouldn't have the clear numbers until the next morning. So they wanted me to come in again that Friday morning to do a fasting lab where they checked my blood work after not eating for 8 hours, which, as a 14-year-old kid in high school, I'm certain that you can imagine telling a boy not to eat for 8 hours is very difficult for them to hear, because suddenly it's like, oh my god, I'm not going to eat for 8 hours, I'm going to starve? But they said, all right, just the appointment's going to be at 8 a.m., so you get to miss a couple hours of school, and you're not going to have that, and you're not going to have to miss a meal or anything just because, oh, whoop-de-doo, you slept from midnight to 8 a.m. You're not even really fasting, that's just normalcy. Even though that was the case, I still treated it like it was my last supper that night. And my parents made spaghetti that night, which noodles have boatloads of carbohydrates. I had milk, of course, with my meal, but we also had some root beer in the fridge still, and I had some of that after a glass of milk. And I had peanut butter Oreos, which were, and still are, my number one weakness. I love those things. So, peanut butter Oreos are carbs, root beer is carbs, milk is carbs, pasta is carbs. These are all carbohydrates. If you know anything about diabetes, you understand that consuming carbohydrates raises the blood sugar. And if your pancreas isn't producing the necessary insulin to absorb the sugar from the bloodstream into your cells, then you start to have an issue where your bloodstream gets clogged up. It starts slowing down. Your heart has to work harder to pump blood just because of the fact that it's so thick. So, because I had so many carbohydrates that night, I was just so insatiably thirsty. I didn't know anything about the disease of diabetes, so I didn't really see a problem in me trying to satiate my thirst with more root beer. But once midnight came along, I said, all right, I had to go to water now, which is boring. I hate water. Whatever. And unfortunately, the next morning when I went to the doctor, they tested my blood sugar and they said, all right, you can go home. We're going to be just an hour or so and we're going to call you with the results. At about 9 a.m. that morning, they call my mother and they say, yeah, his blood sugar is exceptionally high. We recommend taking him to the ICU in the Children's Hospital in Omaha. My fears of the current status went from just like, it's whatever, I'll be fine, I'm certain I don't have this disease, whatever it even is, to, oh crap, they're taking me to the intensive care unit in the Children's Hospital in Omaha. And that was when I experienced the rude awakening that something is desperately wrong. Over the next 3 days, from Friday till Sunday, I spent my time in the hospital. Thankfully, once I got to the hospital, I spent only like 3 or 4 hours in the ICU when they put me on an IV to hydrate myself, to kind of lessen my blood sugar that I was experiencing such a high that they needed to bring me down. Then I spent the remaining days just learning about this disease, learning how to take care of myself. And I remember at one point that I had to get over my fear of needles, actually. And the doctor said, all right, listen, you can either take the shot yourself or you can die. And, you know, as blunt and as caustic as his bedside manner was, he was right. If I wanted to live, I needed to get over my fear of needles, my fear of shots, and just face it and do what must be done. The most important lesson that I learned from that instance was that indulging yourself in times of uncertainty can be lethal. You don't know if you think that there's something wrong with you medically, and then you go and consume in excess anything. In my case, it was carbohydrates, but I mean, it could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be whatever. If you were to go and consume in excess, that could really bite you in the long run. So tread carefully when you're uncertain about where things are going. A couple of years down the line, I was a junior in high school at this point, and it was about late February. My family was getting a new car, and I was excited because I was old enough to drive, which means my father was going to use me as a second driver for when we picked up the car. I'd drive the old car on the way back, and he would drive the new car, and I was like, yes! Several hours of totally unmonitored drive time where I could listen to music unbearably loud. I was pumped. Now, on the way to the location where we were going to buy the new car, which was in Des Moines, Iowa, we stopped somewhere in Omaha. We had to get some gas for our car, right? Because we were driving a Mercury Grand Marquis. So we had to keep the thing well fed because it was a boat. The Mercury Grand Marquis is just a boat with wheels. So when we were leaving the gas station, we heard a click as we were pulling out from the apron onto the road. And my father and I stopped for a second, looked at each other, and he said, did you hear that? And I said, yeah. And then there was some concern as he was trying to figure out if there was something wrong with his car. But as we were pulling away, I saw a flattened tin can on the ground, so I said, oh, there's a tin can on the ground. I'm willing to bet we just ran over that and that's what caused the noise. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. What it actually was the ball joints that he had recently replaced only 4 months earlier clicking because they weren't properly lubricated by the mechanics that installed them, which has a whole nother area of anger that I still kind of hold for people that are careless when it comes to maintaining other people's cars. It is your job to make sure that they're well cared for as you are paid for it, but I digress. So we make it to the place in Des Moines where we were buying this car from. It goes great. The test drive is great. The car seems fantastic. Let's buy it. Let's pay for it. Let's get out of here. So we left. And we were about an hour, maybe 2 hours in. We were getting close to Omaha when we decided to pull over at a rest area. You know, my father, who was nearing 60 at the time, can only stand to drive for so long before, you know, his legs are tired or, you know, his butt is sore from sitting in the car for too long. So he needed to get out and stretch. So he called me. He said, hey, listen, we need to pull over. I just need to get out and stretch for a moment. I said, all right. We pull over. We stand. We have our break. We stretch our legs. Get some drinks at the water fountain at the rest area. And then we hop back in and continue going. As we hopped on the exit ramp, my father got ahead of me. We got separated as there was a semi in front of me, a semi behind me, and a semi to my left. Now, here's where things get interesting. We were on the road for about 60 seconds before I just hear a pop. And in that moment, everything happened at once. You honestly couldn't even tell what was happening until everything had already happened. I suddenly lost control and got forced into the semi that was to my left at highway speeds. And then I bounced off the semi and then went straight into the ditch on the right. I sat there in shock. Thankfully, I had my seatbelt on, and I was just trying to figure out what just happened. I called my father, and I told him about the whole situation, and then he told me to call 911 just to report it to the police that I had an accident. And then after several hours of an ordeal, standing out in the cold, trying to explain everything that happened, and then we had to get the car towed, and the mechanic that came to tow our car saw that the A-frame had completely dropped and that it looked like a ball joint had punctured my left tire, which forced me into the semi to my left, and then caused all sorts of front-end steering damage and ended up propelling me into the ditch where it rendered the car unusable. You see, the thing is, when you're driving on the highway at 70 miles an hour, if you were to suddenly be forced to veer left, if it wasn't for that semi that was there, I would have gone over past the left lane and into head-on traffic, presumably leading me to a head-on collision with somebody that was on the opposing end of the road. And at highway speeds, in a car like a Grand Marquis that wasn't necessarily the highest safety rating, that would have easily killed me. So, the first lesson here is kind of a pragmatic one. Ladies and gentlemen, pay attention to your cars. If there is something wrong in terms of noises coming from your car, or there's a check engine light on, check it out, because otherwise you're going to end up somewhere out in the middle of nowhere or far away from home, and you're not going to be able to get anywhere, and you're going to have to pay a huge towing bill. If not, cause a accident and potentially injure or kill yourself or others. The second lesson here is, it was one of my strongest influences of my faith. I've been raised a Christian for the majority, if not all my life. That instance really kind of opened my eyes to precisely how lucky I am. And you see, I have been what I think mathematically is too lucky. I've already listed several other instances in which I've nearly died, but 7 years that I've had diabetes, I've had numerous instances where I should have been either comatose or dead. And I've been way too lucky in dodging death for me to not have some definitive faith that for some reason God is watching out for me. So that was really the time that it opened my eyes to precisely how lucky I am, and it reaffirmed and solidified potentially my faith for life. But that leads me to the final subject of this podcast, which is a time that I nearly died later on that year. It was June, between my junior and senior year. As a Christian, I had some very clear concepts on rules, on justice, and I knew what I believed to be wrong and right. I knew what was wrong and I knew what was right. But anybody that knows me knows that I am also pretty far from exemplary when it comes to actually doing what is right according to my faith. And I was experiencing some heavy mental conflicts because of that. Anybody that knows me knows that I have a serious swearing problem. And I was also angry. I was lazy. My sense of humor is really messed up. And there's a litany of other reasons as to why I had these conflicts with what I believed was right, what I should be doing, and what I actually was doing. But the number one reason I'd say is that I saw myself wasting my time and my life, and I hated it. I had been given so many things, and yet I had the audacity to spend most of my time either playing video games or doing stuff that is just fundamentally meaningless. I could have actually done something that mattered, and it bothered me a lot. There was a point in which I hadn't slept for 40 hours, roughly. And I was so angry and disappointed and mostly guilty with myself and how I was wasting all my gifts, how I was abusing God's forgiveness. And music has been a massive influence on my life, and there was a song by O Sleeper called In All Honesty. And the lyrics in the bridge say, "You can't see the fairness as your clarity, and the better man is what your heart wants to be. But you break every trusted chance that I bring your way." So if it's justice you seek, in death it should be. And I focused on the last couple lines of that verse. If justice you seek, in death it should be. You see, I wasn't somebody that was necessarily all about forgiveness and love and happiness. I was about justice. I was about what was right. And it wasn't right that I was wasting my life doing meaningless crap. It wasn't right that I received all these blessings despite the fact that I was lazy, I was angry, I was vile, among other things that I don't even know how much I could bring myself to admit. And there was one point in which I was just so very angry with myself and disappointed and guilty during that 40-hour span in which I hadn't slept. I said, "You're right. If it's justice I seek, in death it should be." So metaphorically speaking, I took a page out of Bible's playbook and I intended to fall on a sword, or more specifically in my case, I had a 10-inch bayonet that I aimed roughly at where my heart is. I wasn't necessarily a doctor. I was totally guessing. And I stood next to my bed, and I was prepared to just fall on the floor with it just pointed at my heart. And I was standing there, and in the millisecond before I planned to fall, I stopped. And I visualized the future of what would happen here. More specifically, I visualized my mother and my father standing 6 feet above my grave. And I imagined my brother standing next to them, my friends standing next to them. And the looks on their faces that I saw, the sheer sorrow that I realized I would leave in my wake, was something that I realized I couldn't do. Because if there's one thing that is right and just on this planet, it is that parents should not bury their children. Because if they do, it would destroy them. The other lesson that I've taken over the years looking back is that suicide is a grenade, but you are the grenade. Everybody that's close to you is just a normal person, but once you commit suicide, you turn yourself into a grenade and you pull that pin. That is what happens. And once you detonate, that shrapnel flies through the air. The explosion, it burns, it eviscerates, it rends all the people that are close to you. The people that are closest to you, i.e. your parents, get hurt the most. And if there's one thing that I knew was right on this earth, it is that my parents are far too good of people to deserve that sort of trauma. Because quite frankly, I'm not certain if either of them could have actually survived it. There's a statistic that says that once somebody loses a family member or a loved one, their survivability rate goes drastically down, especially in elderly. Once elderly couples lose their partner, their likelihood of surviving within the year falls drastically. Now, if my parents were to lose a child, knowing how loving my parents are, I don't think that they could have handled it. Maybe they could have. Maybe they're stronger than I realize, and that is entirely possible, but simply put, I think that it would have easily have just absolutely destroyed them for the rest of their lives, if not actually killed them. So, the final lesson to take here is that parents do not bury their children, and that you do not want to set off this grenade when there's people that are close to you. You don't want to set off a chain reaction in case there's any grenades nearby. So continue to fight, if not for yourself, then for everybody that's close to you. It may not help with the problems at hand. You may not feel better about yourself. You may remain depressed, but at least with this idea in mind, it keeps you alive.
Dodging death is a second chance, and each success should not be taken for granted. Let it teach you, and it might just save your life in the future. Thanks for listening.